Several years ago, I found myself at a bioethics conference having dinner with a group of colleagues. One of the gentlemen with us happened to be someone with no limbs, no legs, and to be specific, very foreshortened arms with hands right at the end. This was a gentleman who was born in the era where women were given thalidomide to help them deal with extreme nausea, and it led to severe deformities of limbs like he had. A delightful and highly accomplished gentleman, he viewed his body as perfectly delightful as well, as did his family. Absolutely amazing stories, fascinating stories about his parents' attitude. They'd actually seen his condition on the ultrasound and said, well, yes, people come in lots of different shapes and sizes. For him, what he had was a normal human body. Now, using that body in the built environment he found himself in sucked. It's a world built for people who are bipedal. So steps everywhere, even in the restaurant, okay? Curbs, all those familiar issues we know about ways in which we erect barriers to people who have different modes of mobility, okay? So for sure, he regarded himself as having a disability relative to the environment he was in, but understood intrinsically, in terms of the function of his body, he was perfectly satisfied. What is a disability? One of the most fascinating issues in bioethics asks us in the last few years to look at this question, to ask conceptual questions about quality of life, to raise queries about whether we've made assumptions, those who are able-bodied, about what different forms of life might be, and whether we've mistaken our lack of imagination with an ethical conclusion. Well, to explore, let's return to the gentleman without limbs. So I made a strong statement. I said that while he saw his body as having a disability relative to a world built around a bipedal assumption, intrinsically he didn't see it as less functional than any of the bodies I look before me here and see. Now, I imagine that some of you, even if you wouldn't raise it publicly, might disagree. Surely there's less function to somebody who has fewer limbs. But let me ask you now to imagine a fanciful example. Interplanetary travel and a new form of life comes down that looks a lot like you and me, except they have 4 arms, not 2. They look at us and they think of us as incredibly incapacitated because they can do so many things with their 4 arms, and we have but the 2. If one of their babies was born with just 2 arms, they would think it an incredible tragedy. They might even abort the baby, right? Does the fact that they, this fanciful species, had 4 arms make you now suddenly, right now, in this moment, feel now disabled, deformed, less functional? I doubt it. Also, when we think about why a disability must be intrinsically more problematic and not just relative to the environment, sometimes what we're thinking of are people who incur a disability in the midst of their life. For instance, war veterans, right? Wars all over the world, leading to lots of limbs lost. Now, to be sure, that is a devastating occurrence. That is a full-blown trauma. But in part, that's because of the pain and the suffering of the injury, not the resulting end state. And in deep part, it's because the person is undergoing what we might call a radical existential disruption. The body they once knew, by which they understood their place in the world, their relationships, their projects, the trajectory they had imagined for themselves was with their prior body. And without asking for it, and in a sudden, often violent manner, suddenly the trajectory stopped. And they'll have to build a whole new one, down to every detail of your life, assumptions you make every day, and it's so familiar you don't even realize it. You know, how will you get up the stairs? How will you feed yourself? What will your career be? How do others see you? So those are real and huge issues, but those are what we might call diachronic issues. Across time, if you start with a baseline of one body and without asking for it in violent ways, get switched to a different body, that's a loss, because it's a loss of what you knew, what your bodily home was. That's different from the gentleman I was talking about who was born with that body. That body was his home. And every bit of detail you think about, of how you navigate your physical world, the trajectory you imagine, what your projects are, how others see you, was already started and given. And to him, it might be like the thought experiment of suddenly asking to graft new limbs he had no idea what to do with or wanted. That would be the deformity. What is a disability?